and welcome back, everyone. We'll now start the next session for the AI Policy Conference. This is the next Research Spotlight session. And as you've seen in the conference so far, we have these exciting and emerging collaborations between AI policymakers, AI technologists, and AI researchers. And at my institute, at the ETH Zurich, the Center for Law and Economics, we have an interdisciplinary environment where we explore the legal and economic aspects of technology and policy, also working with the ETH AI Center on issues of regulation and legal tech. In today's Academic Research Spotlight session, you'll get another taste of the type of interdisciplinary, broad, diverse AI research that's being done at ETH Zurich and other universities in Switzerland. We're going to have 3 presentations today by ETH Zurich professors. First, we'll have Mrinmaya Sachan, then Roger Wattenhofer, and then myself. If you saw the Research Spotlight session yesterday, you know how these work, but for each of these presentations, we'll have some time for audience Q&A, and it's the most interesting and exciting part of the session. So please ask questions in the Zoom chat. I will ask the speakers or I'll unmute you. So let's get started. First, we have Mrinmaya Sachan, a professor of computer science at ETH Zurich and a specialist in natural language processing, knowledge discovery, and reasoning. Today, he will present on AI for education.
Hi, Elliott. Thanks all for the invitation. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about some of my work, and I would love to brainstorm with all of you guys a little bit about policy implications of some of this work. So yeah, feel free to interrupt me and feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to take questions. So let's get started, Elliott.
Please.
Okay, so this is so today's talk is about some work that we have been doing in my research group on natural language processing for education, where we are trying to think about how we can build systems that can be useful to improve educational technologies, like on platforms such as MOOCs. And this stems a little bit from my PhD research on sort of building models that can answer these kind of questions, as you can see on the left, but also on understanding textbooks and incorporating natural language processing models on this kind of data. So let's get started. So for those of you who may not be aware, natural language processing is a field at the intersection of computer science, AI, and linguistics. And the goal is to essentially enable computers to understand language and at the same time to be able to do tasks that are useful. So we're thinking about tasks like asking a question to Siri or Google Translate. You can think about these as some practical, important applications of natural language processing. So NLP is awesome, and we've made a lot of progress in the recent years. For those of you who've been following, you might be reading these news articles about how now we have a computer that can beat humans on quiz shows, on popular question answering benchmarks. Our models are kind of approaching human performance. We are achieving human parity in speech recognition, at least on some data sets. And we've also achieved purportedly human parity on translating Chinese to English. So this is a lot of what has been going around in the media, and undoubtedly the progress is awesome. However, there are a bunch of caveats, right? So let me start by saying that the progress in NLP really shows us what the kind of opportunities are. We are beginning to see the use of NLP in more and more high-stakes settings. And one of them that I'm interested in is education and e-learning, right? So we're seeing a lot of work in natural language processing models to in these educational platforms, in intervention studies, and sort of helping students achieve their goals. And we're seeing more and more of things like that. On the other hand, these models, as I said, are actually extremely unreliable. So here is an example from one of the famous papers from Petruccia and Persilian, who were trying to analyze question answering models and how robust they are. So here is a sample example. So you have, say, an article from Wikipedia on Super Bowl 50, and you have this question: what is the name of the quarterback who was 38 in Super Bowl, right? And the model actually originally makes the correct prediction, John Elway. But then they found that it is very easy to fool this model by adding this kind of a sentence adversarially at the end of the paragraph, right? So much so that the performance of these models can go down from something like 80% to about half of its value, something in 40s. So this shows how these models are really unreliable. It's very easy for them to fool them. It's very easy for them to not work well when under some kind of distributional shifts, for example. So this is challenging, right? So there is this question: how can we really use these kinds of extremely unreliable models in these kinds of high stakes situations, one such as education? So my group grapples a little bit with these issues, not so much with policy issues yet, but this is kind of work that we're excited about. So we work on building models that can, for example, answer these standardized test questions. These are questions that we probably have seen in our lives, right? It's like a GRE exam or an SAT exam. So we build models that can answer these kinds of questions. And the goal is really the goal is really to build these models for a scientific purpose. We want to understand that can we really build a model that can reason in the way that is required to answer these kinds of problems? Can we use the kind of domain knowledge that is required to answer these questions? So it's a scientific endeavor. However, as we've been progressing, we've also been starting to think about where do we go from here, right? So we have a bunch of work on reading comprehension, on these kinds of math word problems known as algebra word problems. And you have probably seen some of these at school. Liz had 8 apples. She gave some of her apples to John. Now Liz has 2 apples left. So how many apples did John get, right? So it's a fairly simple textual reasoning problem that we see in the student curriculum, and we've been doing some work on building models that can answer these kinds of questions, map them to some kind of a meaning representation, and then solve them, right? Then we've done some work on these kinds of geometry or physics problems on the right. So we've done some work here. And we are now excited to think about what do we do with these systems? Can we really use them in the educational platforms? So I'll go a little bit more into some of the details of my work, and then we'll talk about some questions and some for you guys to help me out in terms of policy making and ethical issues around this work. So here's some snapshots of what we did. So here is an example problem of a reading comprehension task. You're given a passage like this on the left, and you're asked a question with possibly multiple choices on the right. What made Anna very nervous? And if you were to read this passage very deeply, you can say that the passage says that there were 10 students in the spelling bee. This made Anna very nervous. So it's fairly easy to conclude that the answer is the other 10 students. So this is one of the easier data sets in this domain, but there is a lot of work. And this is actually quite hard, really building a system that can understand a piece of text and answer questions questions that are actually intended to be challenging for students is actually hard, right? Then we have also done some work on science question answering, where the goal is that you're given a question like this: which of the following gases cause the greenhouse effect? And you could use literally anything. You can use textbooks, you can use these periodic tables, dictionaries, study guides, so sort of all of these things that students use. And can you answer this kind of a question, right? So there are challenges in the community around this. And we built some solutions that maybe are not so important to get into.
Mrinmaya, you said it was okay to interrupt. I hope it is.
Yes, of course.
For the previous slide on the answer scientific questions using anything, have you noticed? Have you learned anything about what sources are useful for the algorithmic solution, for the automated solution, and are those sources different than what helps students learn these to answer these types of questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've not done this study to be honest, but we did find some of these dictionaries that have sort of terminology for students. These kinds of study guides that have some kind of questions useful for training such a model. So students use some of this kind of external knowledge that is encoded in this form. We found these periodic tables in some kind of chemistry questions also useful. So when we did this work, this was way back about four plus years ago. So deep learning was just sort of coming of age, and at that point of time, it was actually useful to have these kinds of data sources. It's an interesting question whether we would see the same today.
Right. So you're implying that taking like GPT-3 instead might actually be better than having these domain specific sources.
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah. So I think the question really is about what are the kind of questions you're looking at. If the questions require a lot of domain knowledge, like for example, this question requires understanding that these compounds have this symbol, right? So I need to do this kind of a mapping, and models like GPT-3 may not be really good at something like that, right? Because it's a specific domain, plus you need this kind of symbolic understanding of these symbols. So right. I can imagine maybe it's useful to use some of this information, but yeah. I can see I would not be surprised if GPT-3 was already doing us par with these systems. Yeah.
And one follow-up relating this science question answering to the reading comprehension part. Do you have an intuition of which of these tasks will be more difficult in the longer run?
I see. So that's a good question. So that's a good question. So I think if so science question answering has its challenges, and for example, one of the main challenges here is really using this kind of background knowledge, right, and integrating it with some kind of understanding of text, and that's really the challenge here. However, I think in some kind of relatively narrow domain. So next I'll talk about sort of geometry, and we were quite successful with solving those kinds of problems, right? You can kind of get away with some fairly simple solutions, right? But if the goal is to answer reading comprehension problems, you require a lot of skills. You require sort of causal understanding, this kind of symbolic understanding, and there's like this very long tail of lots of skills that you need to be able to have to answer these problems, right? So I would say both are challenging, but if you really wanted to, if your goal was really to solve a task, I would say in general reading comprehension is hard.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll move on a little bit more to just give you a flavor of what kind of problems we're looking at. Another set of problems that I find very exciting are these algebra word problems. These are sort of the problems part of middle school math, something like these daily life problems. I have these many crayons in a drawer. Mary took 3 crayons out of the drawer. How many of them are there now? Right? It's really simple problems given to kids, right? And you have to map sort of the problem in some equation or some set of equations that can then be solved to answer these problems. And from a scientific perspective, this is exciting because you really need to think about how natural language understanding sort of works in a mathematical setup, and how do you really incorporate this kind of reasoning into your model, right? So it's an interesting question, and we've contributed, let me skip this slide. So we've contributed to these kinds of problems. Then an extension of that you can think about is these kinds of reasoning problems in the space of geometry or Newtonian physics, where the goal is to apply the axioms of that particular domain that you know, like Euclid's axioms or Newton's laws, and how do you encode them, and then how do you apply them and solve these kinds of problems. And we made some progress in this domain. So the way we solve this, for those who care, is that we think about some kind of a formal language in that particular domain. We extract some of this information from either textbooks or using some domain expertise about the subject. Then this is kind of a domain theory which encodes these axioms of geometry or physics that I was talking about. And we have some methods to extract them, maybe semi-automatically from textbooks. And then once you have this kind of a question, we have a parser that maps this question or a diagram into some kind of a representation, integrates this into a joint representation, and then reasons using this knowledge that we have. So this is sort of the overall flow of how things work. And I'll quickly move on to like a demo, maybe that's more interesting. So we did set this work on a real standardized testing data set. We used questions derived from the SAT exam. So we had like a practice exams and a real SAT exam. And then we also took questions from a textbook in India. So we have a bunch of data sets and we analyzed this. And this is how things work, right? So we found that an average, so this is how the average students does on these 3 different data sets. So we have a practice SAT exam, an official SAT exam, and this textbook data set I was talking about. So the average student scores something in the range of 40s and 50s on these 3 different benchmarks. So we're using, by the way, the standard SAT scoring guidelines. You get 4 points by answering a correct question, and you get -1 if you answer a question incorrectly, right? So random guessing gets you 0. So this is how the average students do in this test. So then we found that if we build like rule-based, what is known as like an expert system, we can actually tune it. So we did some work on tuning it on one particular data set, on this practice portion of the exam, and you can do quite well. But then it ends up not doing as well in the official exam, and it does much worse on the textbook data set, which is actually much harder. And then the sort of the technique that I described using the parsing to programs system, if I give it actual axioms, so all the axioms are now encoded by me in this first one. So there is a lot of human intervention that's going here, right? So the model gets a score about 70 or 80 on these tests, but we're cheating a little bit because we're giving them this knowledge. But then we also have some methods to maybe extract this automatically from textbooks, and we achieve a score about 40 or 50, 40 or 50 or 60, depending on these 3, by extracting them this kind of knowledge from textbooks, right? So still sort of comparable to the average test taker, right? So this is the average test taker, not the best test taker here yet, right? And we can do well in this sort of a narrow domain of just geometry questions from the SAT exam, right? So this is.
Mrinmaya, could you comment briefly on how are the diagrams featurized? Is that like a custom system, or do you just use just the pixels as data, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there are multiple parts of this. This is actually a bunch of papers done with collaboration with Minjun Seo, who is also at the Allen Institute of AI. And so this is so this uses some kind of very old computer vision techniques using sort of line detectors, edge detectors, and some kind of domain knowledge of what you expect in the domain, right? So we know that we'd expect triangles and circles, but we not expect like a picture of a truck, right? So we have a lot of domain knowledge that is going into the system, and the goal has been just to sort of solve this problem somehow. Yeah. So it's not generalizable. It's very hard to do this for another domain, but if this is really our goal, then we can kind of do it. All right. Okay, so I'll move on to sort of a demo. Let's see if this still works. So here are the kind of questions we're looking at. So there are a bunch of questions. By the way, you can still go to this URL on top and look at this. So let's zoom in to one particular question. In this figure, CD is an equilateral triangle, ABC is a square area of 1. What is the perimeter of the polygon? Right. So the way this works is that there is a parser that is extracting some kind of knowledge in the form of these formulas. And then it is using some domain knowledge here to solve this question. So this is how it's doing is it looks at the side of a square. It says the side of a square is a square root of an area. So it says all of these sides are 1, and then says all of these equilateral sides of an equilateral triangle are equal. So each of these are 1, and then it computes the perimeter by applying the formula of like adding up the sides of a polygon. Right. So it's super simple. And if you really wanted to do something like this, it can work. Yeah. So thanks for pointing out the link to everyone. Okay. So let's move on. So this is sort of old stuff. A lot of this was part of my PhD thesis, and I want to tell you a little bit about where we are going next. And this might be more relevant to sort of policymakers and what they think about this. So one of the things that we are now trying to think about is how can we use these solvers, these kinds of work that we've done, building these solvers in say intelligent tutoring, right? So one of the things we can do is that we can maybe use interventions from these models to assist students if they're trying to learn how to say understand geometry, right? So here is an example from a tutor built at Carnegie Mellon by Vincent Aleben and others, and there is some work going on in integrating our work into this cognitive tutor. And here's how this works. So there's the student who is trying to solve a particular problem and wants like some kind of a hint because they're stuck and they cannot solve this particular problem. So the system produces this kind of hint. So a hint like the highlighted angles are on the same side of the traversal, so these angles must be equal. So this kind of like what axiom to use next. So the solver, if it knows, if it's able to answer the question correctly, can intervene by providing these kinds of explanations to the student, hopefully. So this is all still research. We're not there yet in terms of actually using the system yet. So, but this is something that I'm excited about, trying to think about how these kinds of solvers can be used to improve education. And then we're thinking about other ways of enhancing these intelligent tutors with natural language processing, right? So you can imagine that we can use these kind of hint generation systems, we can use retrieval-based systems. There's some work we're interested in on sort of a dialogue-based tutoring agent, which sort of has a dialogue with a student, engages with them. So it's sort of very hard problems, mostly in the domain of research. So here's one example. So one example is that, let's say a student comes to me and has a particular doubt in a particular question. How about we don't even give them an explanation. We have a corpus, a catalog of questions or solutions and videos, maybe generated by teachers, by actual teachers. And what we return to the students is just like a similar question and how to solve that similar question, right? That's sort of the easiest way of helping them, right, in this particular context. And there's this work we are doing in organic chemistry for this problem. Another piece of work here that we are this is exactly not what we are doing, but we are looking at sort of generally hint generation with NLP. So if you have a particular textbook and this kind of a question, can you provide hints by highlighting maybe part of the textbooks that gets used in answering this kind of a question, right? Then you can imagine a dialogue-based system where the agent is trying to be maybe not a teacher, but at least a teaching assistant, I would say, and is trying to give feedback to the students, for example, and using some kind of these teaching strategies, right? So the agent gives students some kind of feedback, maybe gives them some kind of information, maybe a hint, maybe elaborates on some particular thing, summarizes, maybe recaps the thing that has been discussed so far in the conversation. So a bunch of these strategies that teachers use. So the challenge here is like, can we build a system that can be used in a tutoring setting? Yeah. So we're thinking about those kinds of things. And then our interests go much beyond these few examples that I talked about on improving textbooks. Maybe automatic grading is another big area of NLP for education. These kinds of reading, writing assistants that you see, such as in Google Docs or a bunch of others, grammatical error correction systems, etc. There's a lot of work on educational data mining, student logs, personalization to students is a big issue. Language learning, things like Duolingo is another big area. So this area is quite vast, and there are a bunch of opportunities. I would say it's a very underexplored topic in NLP. But there are a bunch of policy and ethical considerations here. It's this education has traditionally been tackled mostly in a very by teachers, and there is clearly a relationship between the student and the teacher, and we're trying to sort of intervene, right? Some degree of trust that we're trying to intervene by building these systems. So it's important to think about these considerations, right? So there are these, for example, there are these ethical issues in using such a system in student-facing settings. So there are things like user safety, like privacy issues. There's this issue of trust and reliability by using these kinds of systems. These AI systems are often incorrect. So at best, what you saw was sort of systems that get like 60%, 70% of these questions right? So when these systems we cannot, as engineers, cannot trust them, how can we allow students to trust these systems, right? But at the same time, it would be really useful to have something like this, right? We would really love to have systems that can scale education. I think scalability is the biggest challenge in the third world, where people don't have access to great teachers, right? So there are a bunch of these issues. Is it ethical to use these kinds of systems in a very learning platform? In a learning platform, how do we really integrate AI into the learning process? Clearly, they cannot replace teachers, but how do we think about like the power structure here? Can we think of these agents as assistants, so the students don't completely rely on them, but can somehow make use of them? So there's a lot of like computer-human interaction issues here involved as well, right? And how we really position this is a challenge. And this is especially important because often the target population here are not even adults, right? So there are issues of multiple kinds of issues like fairness, transparency, bias. These models are known to be to have these different kinds of biases, such as gender biases. One key thing that shows up in a bunch of AI applications. So clearly, how do we tackle these kinds of issues? There is some discussion, of course, in the field on how these kinds of systems are going to replace the workforce. I don't so much believe this is going to happen in education. I think we have a great trust in our teachers, so that's not going to happen. But maybe, I don't know, very, very far into the future, this would be an issue to think about. Another thing to think about is sort of the cost-benefit analysis. So clearly in education, we really, really want this. There is a huge benefit to be had if we can improve textbooks or translate textbooks into other languages in which they're not available, right? And make this accessible to people who cannot otherwise access this kind of material. So there's a lot of benefit to be gained, but we need to at least understand what the costs are, right? And somebody needs to do this analysis. So yeah, that's all I had. I would love to hear thoughts from people around these things.
Thank you, Mrinmaya. We actually have an interesting question just on this slide. I'm going to unmute Deborah Webster so she can ask the question.
Thank you very much, Elliott. And thank you very, very much for your insight. God, I love the way you guys think. I was just wondering so I'm always looking to how we could improve the democratic process. And I shared a link in the chat to explain further my thinking, because we don't have time here. Could we use this learning model to quote unquote, teach voters how to be more discerning in the policies they're voting for, so that they're more engaged and more conscious and conscientious voters, so they're not just sucked into the spin of politicians?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Deborah. This is really interesting. So there is a lot of, I cannot imagine how my work directly can be used in this domain, but I can definitely imagine there is a lot of scope of natural language processing models here. So one can imagine thinking about argumentation. How can we place these arguments in the right way, right? There's this work on the IBM debater, which builds like these arguments in a debate. So there is definitely some scope of building models. There's definitely scope on sort of building models that can argue positions, can inform users, maybe can take a more logical or a scientific process of argumentation in mind. There's a lot of scope, for example, of tackling things like misinformation, right? That's a major issue in democratic processes, right? There's a scope to use these models in tackling the menace of disinformation and be able to argue a certain position from the perspective of science, from a more logical perspective. So there are opportunities there. Yes, and I think it would be great to think about how we can do it. Yeah, I think definitely Deborah.
Great. Thank you for the question, Deborah. If there's any additional questions, please ask them in the Zoom chat. And we also can, if not, we can go to the next presentation. But there was one point I wanted to also note about this last slide, Mrinmaya, which is I think it's not just a overall cost and benefit question. I think there's also a lot of distributional consequences, because you can imagine that some students will benefit from these tools more than others, and for some students they might be much better off with a human teacher. So it feels like there needs to be some impact evaluation studies to see how it will work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. We're just scratching the surface, starting to build some of these solutions. Yeah, and we're thinking about some of our first studies. So yeah, any feedback on this is useful. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you again, Mrinmaya. Thanks for the very interesting presentation and for the discussion. We will now go to the next presentation by Professor Roger Wattenhofer from the Distributed Computing Group at the Department of Electrical Engineering at the ETH Zurich. Roger has broad interests and expertise in algorithms and computing, many topics related to our conference. But today we are very happy to have him present on AI versus politicians for democracy. Roger, you can please start as you like.
All right, my screen sharing still doesn't work, it seems.
Are you logged on separately from?
Yeah, I have another machine. Maybe I need to do it like this. All right.
Maybe try it again now.
It doesn't want me to do it. I don't know why it's set up. Usually it works quite nicely. So I probably have to do it with my regular computer screen here, like where I was hoping to see the chat and stuff like that. That's why I usually use the tablet for these screen sharing things. So can you see this now?
Yes, it works well.
Okay, so now I don't have any notes anymore, but let's hope for the best. So thanks for the invitation. So my talk is going to be quite different, I think, from the other research talks you have seen yesterday and also so far today. So all the others seem to kind of present their, best of research, whereas I do the exact opposite. I present not just the worst of my research, but also something which is not really published research in any way. So I want to thank my student, Zhao Meng, who worked with me on this, but this is really work in progress in this sense that we only worked on this in the last week. I made him help me with getting some plots together that I'll show later on. All right, so I want to talk about what really should hit the core of this workshop in some sense, the AI versus policy, and I'm looking at it from the angle of really replacing politicians with machines, okay? So you get into the right spirit of this talk if you think about something like this, some dystopian future, where the AI controls the world. I'm actually trying to sell this to you as a good thing, but I hope you disagree, and then we get a bit of a discussion going. All right, so here I have a bunch of politicians. Personally, I don't like politicians very much, not even some of those that are on this picture, but maybe you do like politicians. So if you do like politicians, or particularly these politicians of the G7 here, then I have another picture from you. This is from The Guardian. Apparently, these are the worst politicians, according to The Guardian. I didn't choose them. These were like, this picture was given to me by this Guardian article of the 9 or so most hated politicians in the world. And I'm sure there's one of them which boils your blood among those guys, right? So that's what you kind of should think about. That's also a bit regarding the panel. We had this before. There was a comment by one of the panelists that, not all the politicians are perfect, and I would agree with that sentiment. And so why are they not perfect? Well, one thing is this: there's a lot of corruption going on, of course, for policymakers or for people who just have a lot of power. And one might also say some of them are not very smart, maybe, or not very smart for the public, even though there's no corruption going on. I found this quote online from Franz Kafka, which basically says that lots of people who are idiots are politicians, but it's not correct. So unfortunately, he never said that. But the quote is so good that I still felt I should include it in my little talk. Good. So what do we want to do in this talk? I want to see if we could remove politicians and just let AI do the job. So that's the basic promise here. Is the AI that we have today still worse than the politicians? So that's the question I wanted to answer. And when I say that, I should maybe quickly say what my model is. So I think about democracies, and of course we have different types of democracies. These are on this picture maybe the two most important ones. So we have direct democracies, where the public, the people, kind of directly decides on laws and rules, how it probably was in ancient societies like in Iceland or so. It was a bit like this at some point, and maybe also in other parts of the world where the society is very small. These days, most of the democracies, of course, are more on the right-hand side here, where you have elected representatives, and then they vote for you, they decide on the laws and the rules. Usually, people who come to Switzerland are surprised that Switzerland has this left element as well, more than most other democracies, I would say. We have some kind of direct decisions as well by the public. But I would say the majority of decisions still is taken by elected representatives, even in Switzerland. Some people usually who come from Germany, especially, they oppose this idea of direct democracy as we have it, or semi-direct democracy as we have it in Switzerland. They think the people are not smart enough to decide on the rules and laws. I personally would argue that deciding on rules, laws should be actually easier than doing the detour through politicians first, because then you have to decide which politician will decide, right? That sounds almost more complicated. So I would say certainly not clear that the left one is much more difficult than the right one. But I'm looking at the left one in my talk. I really want to get rid of politicians. So in Switzerland, we do, as I said before, we decide on issues quite often. So about every 3 months, there's a vote, and in some places, even a vote like this still exists, that people gather and they vote, not very privacy oriented, I should say. But for most of us, it's actually more like, there's a vote every 3 months on some issues, and you go there and you do the vote. Now, we as humans, we can do this every 3 months. And even then, it's kind of happening quite often. So if you look at the calendar, so to speak, only once in a while, we have to make these decisions. But I would be looking at the situation where we remove the politicians, so we have to decide all the time. It's like, the parliament decides or the government decides maybe every day on several issues. And I want really the people to make this decision every day. So every day I want several decisions to be made by people, which is basically impossible if we do it naively, right? Nobody wants to vote every day about things. So AI to the rescue. So an AI should come and make the decision for us. So that's my plan here. And let me go there. There were some things in the chat, but now or being truthful, yeah. So we'll see, So what is the first idea? The naive idea is this. We have an artificial model, and when I say artificial model, I really think of something like a language processing unit, essentially, which understands how you are as a human, what you feel, what what your political opinion is, and then the machine votes for you. Okay, I literally mean this. Okay, so let's be a bit more concrete. So what we looked at, this is our data. We looked at the smart vote data. So this is a website from Switzerland. It exists also in many other countries. In Germany, for instance, it's called Valomat, and there's other countries which have this. So basically, as a voter, if you want to vote which party should you elect, for instance, in national council elections, as in my example on this slide, then you have to answer some questions. In the deluxe version, it's 75 questions. And the question is, for instance, the first question is questionnaire is, would you support to increase the retirement age to, for instance, 67? And then you can give different answers on the spectrum. You can either give no answer, kind of being neutral about it. You can say yes or rather yes, or you can also weight your answer. You can say, is this an important topic to you or not? And then based on these 75 questions, you would get, a profile of a politician or of a party which would be close to your opinion. So what we actually have access to this data. At some point in the past, I contacted the Smart Vote guys, and to my surprise, they were very open to this idea of sharing this anonymized data. So what we used for today's talk is that we used a sample of 5,000 voters. Smart Vote has much more, and even we have much more. So in fact, for Switzerland, I think about 10% of the voters are doing this. So it's quite substantial. And we know for them what their opinions are. So how do we do this now? So we feed basically the human profile, so what the human wanted to do in Smart Vote, into a natural language processing brain, if you want, okay? And we also feed a voting question, a new voting question into the brain, something like, should we do this or that question mark, a yes, no question. And it's important that this is really a text question, okay? It's not something which has been, augmented in some ways, or, people make computer programs out of it. It's really the same question that usually a voter sees. So we feed the two things into the NLP, and then the NLP, the machine is going to tell directly yes or no. And the idea is then that the machine will do this for all the voters in the country, so to speak. They all have their profiles stored, and anonymously maybe, hopefully. And then the machine would say the majority of our citizens think this is yes or no. And you can do this, of course, several times a day, as often as you like. It doesn't cost much computationally. So how we're doing this, we use one of those language models which can process language. This is what we need for the voting question, for instance, and in fact also for the human profile. So words basically go into this machine. We use the machine BERT. That's why we see BERT here, because it's quite easily available. And we could train it within the week we had time to do this talk. So maybe very quickly, some details how we do this. So we take of the 75 questions we have answered, we take about 60 of them, and this is what we train the system with. Okay, so with the 60 questions we train the system with. Basically, when we want to understand a human, we take the first question, question Q1, and what the human answered to Q1. We take the second question, Q2, what the answer is to Q2, up to Q60, so to speak. We leave one out usually in the training, and then we add one of those questions at the end. And we want to check what the machine would say. This is how we train the machine, how we fine-tune the machine to this voting task. So we check what is the answer the machine gives us, and then we check what did the user actually answer for that. And then we make the machine better, so to speak. So that's the plan, doing this for BERT. For testing then, to see whether our system works, the idea is to take a completely new question. So we again take the profile of the user, so to speak, what were the questions and the answers of the users, or the 60 questions we chose. And then we add a new question text. And now for our testing, we added one of the 15 questions the user answered, but we didn't use for training. And we want to see whether we can guess what the user is saying. Okay, so I hope this is clear. If not, feel free to ask questions. So here is the result of our little study. So we have the machine. I used a very bad machine, HAL 9000 for this, so to speak, as a picture. So we have the voter. So this face you see on the screen is the voter. The voter has 3 possible decisions, either yes, no, or neutral. So we kind of simplify the multiple possible answers, also somewhat yes and whatnot. This all goes to yes. And then don't answer is goes to neutral. And then there's also some no answers, obviously. And so these are the rows in my little matrix. And then I have the columns as well. So this is what the machine said based on the same input, same voter, and same question. Okay, this is what the machine predicts the voter would say. And you can see the green stuff is what we actually want to see. We want both the machine and the voter to say yes, or both say neutral, or both say no. Okay, so that would be success for us, the 3 green values. The red values are the worst. The voter says yes, the machine says no, or vice versa, right? So we totally don't want that. And the gray values are somewhat in between. One says yes, the other one is neutral. You can say, well, machine didn't quite understand me, but at least a little bit. But you can see roughly 60% we are correct, and roughly 20% we are incorrect. So out of 4 questions, we answered 3 correctly and 1 incorrectly, roughly, okay? So you might say this is not very good and not useful. And I would argue it's questionable. So why is that? Because we did also check the politicians. So as a baseline, we have politicians. So in this smart vote data, we not only have the users, but we also have the politicians, several thousands of them actually. Everybody who tried to become a national, member of the National Council is in there. So what we do is we take the first 60 questions again, or actually 60 random questions. We check the answers of a voter against the answers of the politicians, and we choose the politician who is closest to the voter for the first 60 questions. And then for testing, we use the other 15 questions again. And we check, did the politician actually answer the way the voter wants to be answered? And this is the result we get here. I'm sure you looked at it already. And you can see it's slightly better than the one before, but not so much better, okay? So this is you being represented by the best politician, okay? So you see about 20% of a politician still says the wrong thing, and about 60%, or even a bit more, the politician says the right thing. So you're not so well represented actually as you might think, and it's actually even a bit worse because, well, we really chose the best politician for this. But we didn't, discriminate for Canton so far. So maybe you were not allowed to elect that particular politician because he comes from a different region from the country. Or, even if you say, I found my perfect match politician here, and you elect the guy, it might turn out that the guy is still not elected, right? But somebody else is elected, and that person, of course, makes still decisions against you all the time. So I would argue that these numbers are somewhat competitive, okay, somewhat similar. Okay, good. Of course, we can do much more things and we can do much better. So this is kind of the basic setup. Of course, the human could actually check, or at least from time to time, check what the AI suggests and override it as well if it wants to. The human can choose a new AI. Maybe there's competing AIs and they could choose the best one. You could have multiple AIs and make majority decisions, or you could combine it somehow with representation. All these things I think would be possible. Maybe another issue with the AI, and maybe the main issue, is that the language models are quite remarkable. So I tested this not with BERT, but with something better, with GPT-3, which is also accessible. You can enter, you can check how much does it actually understand what's going on. So for instance, if I enter the question, I support an increase of the retirement age to 70. Do I support retirement at 80? That would be a natural question a machine should answer if it really understands what's going on. And the machine here says no, but I don't have a problem with 70, and I think it could be a good start. So this feels like the machine properly understands what's going on. So it probably is able to answer for me such questions. But I tried this as well. I support 70. Should I also agree to retire at 60? And the machine says, no, he said, Yevgeny, then something from a Russian novel probably comes out. So you see that kind of, stinks big time. And I start to wonder about, all the results we have so far.
Roger, we had a clarifying question from the audience. Florian Dorner asks, were the politicians' results all collected at the same time?
It was for the same election, so to speak. So we looked at the national election from about 2 years ago, and the voters and the politicians would answer the same 75 questions. We believe that the politicians actually answered these questions a bit better because they, among themselves, they were more consistent about the other 15 questions, so to speak, than the voters. But it comes from the same election. It should be, that part should be comparable. I should say, however, at this point, it's really work in progress. So, it might even still be that we find a mistake or whatnot. So let me make my last point here. And this is that I'm not so sure I want this HEL 9000 AI, so to speak, which really decides directly for the people. There's a softer version of this that we could think of. And in this softer version, the artificial model still learns what the human thinks, but then it only delegates the vote to an expert, so to speak. So it might say, looking at Roger's policy profile, it's very weird. No party really matches it well. But this is, for instance, a question about, I don't know, law and order, or this is a question about social safety and whatnot. And we believe that based on these things, Roger would rather ask this or that expert. So it's a bit like delegated voting or liquid democracy, that you kind of, push your vote to other people or other organizations. But it's more fine-grained. It's not as coarse-grained as just voting for one party and then be stuck with it. So it's in some sense, here's the picture I wanted to show you for that. So we have the left side of the picture is the same as before. We have the human profile and we have the voting questions. These are fed in NLPs, but then the NLP would suggest an expert. Here, for the sake of not having enough time, I just put like some party pictures up of Swiss parties. And then these, of course, could also be experts. And then these would make the decisions, right? It would say for this voting question, so and so much power goes to the Social Democrats or whatever. And then they would vote according to their feeling by really studying the problem at heart and not just, kind of machine learning, roughly guess. I would think with this system, it probably can beat the current system. That I'm pretty confident about that. And there's many, refinements we could do. We could, have actual expert node parties. We combine with other solutions, as said before. And we can, of course, bootstrap this, is no problem. We can introduce an AI party. Maybe the pirate party would be very good for this because people kind of believe that they're very heterogeneous in the first place already. And if this party wins, let's say 20% of the seats in the election, then the voters who voted for the party will just get 10% of the votes essentially. But the party would split those votes. It would not just say yes or no to the same issue, but it would just, based on what its base would say, would vote according to that. And then you can feel very well represented as a voter. And there's many more problems. And I think these are the biggest problems I found. So such a system would probably not protect minorities very well. It could be that the majority always overpowers the minority. So that would be a problem in my opinion. So it's very tough to do negotiating compromises this way because the system would just make decisions, but never really be able to say, well, if you combine this and that issue together, maybe you can have something better where more people could agree to. And also it cannot make proposals. So we would still need politicians for that part. Right, so so that's that. So these are the two tables again that I presented in this talk. And as I said at the beginning, I want to really say this again. This is like one of, weird ideas, and we just tried it for the sake of this talk, actually. And I'm sure there's many things wrong with it, and feel free to fire back.
This is great. Thank you, Roger. Thank you for making this really, really great set of results just for the conference. Really exciting and intriguing. And I think it really makes you think, what are the goals of government? And so it's a really effective thought experiment at a minimum. And honestly, I think it would be quite interesting if this was just a system that was on a newspaper website, where every time there's a law that's up for parliamentary consideration, your system could provide some, according to our analysis of the direct democracy information about the Swiss population, 70% of people oppose this, or 70% of people support it. It's not, that feels like a useful input to discussion at a minimum. It's kind of simulating a direct democracy referendum on each law. So I think that could already be a useful piece for the discourse.
No, I agree. That's actually a good idea, that you don't go all in at the beginning, of course, and you just have an information system on the side. And
you could start testing it out and see if people agree with it.
What we don't have for smart vote is what actually people voted for eventually. And so even if we would, because I don't think all the parties or all the people in Switzerland would use smart vote equally much. So some parties might be underrepresented in some sense, or so political opinions. But
that's an important caveat, right? So if you could try to get a representative sample on smart vote or reweight it in some way, that feels like a surmountable problem, but something to think about.
Right. So Deborah also asked a question whether we could see whether they delivered on their promises to regain trust. I think this is a bit simpler than what we do, right? Because their promises, right? They would usually, maybe yes, maybe you're right. Maybe you could say, based on our system, we would think that the politician, for instance, should have said yes or no to this issue, because we can, we know the opinion of the politician, even though this exact question never came up. We kind of know how the politician, based on their left, right, or whatever spectrum you have, should have answered.
There's an issue of accountability, right? So if we can hold them to account, it rebuilds trust in our institutions, which is critical for good democracies.
No, I think that's also possible. So to use it on politicians only, so to speak, and not on
because then the flip side of telling politicians this is actually what the people think, then an upcoming politician could take that content, so to speak, to fuel his or her narrative in order to win an election, but actually is lying. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many I look at how humans are hacked. So.
No. I understand. So this is actually something we studied. This has nothing to do with my talk here, almost. But so we looked at the question if political parties, for instance, try to be as populist as possible, in the sense that they always try to find the majority opinion, and then this would be their program essentially. Maybe that's a definition for populism. I don't know. I'm not a political science guy, but we can find, and this is a well-known paradox, that sometimes if you only had two parties, one party doing exactly what the majority always wants, and one party doing the exact opposite, that actually the party doing the exact opposite would win the election. So you can come up with these examples. So it's not so clear that politicians should do that, right? They could even lose votes.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
So one other thought or question I had is, in addition to the three caveats that you brought up, the three limits, I think a fourth that you might consider is, how would the AI or this aggregation system work when it had to meet a budget constraint? So I think that this is, related to your point about, well, it will just decide and decide and decide. Once it has to make trade-offs of, such and such policy will cost X, that has to come from somewhere. I think that's much more difficult to aggregate preferences through a survey. But it would be interesting to think about if there's ways to do that through asking the respondents to prioritize issues, for example.
Yeah. That's something we could also look at the voter data and to see whether voters themselves already are, they usually say, no, of course I support all this. Oh no, I have to pay for it.
Right. Yeah.
But they don't bring the two things together, and we probably could look at the voter data and see whether we find lots of evidence of that, even without the AI part.
Yeah.
Okay, no, good point.
So I think that we've now addressed all the questions in the chat, so we'll go to the next session. Thank you, Roger, and thank you all for the interesting questions and discussion. So actually, this third presentation on AI for better justice, it fits very well with some of the issues that have already been brought up by Mrinmaya and by Roger, and we'll get right into it. So we have just been discussing about, do we want AIs supporting teachers or replacing teachers? And second, we asked, do we want AIs replacing politicians? And there's been surveys along these lines. One recent one has shown that people actually trust robots more than themselves or human financial advisors with investment advice. Another one found that 64% of people would trust a robot more than their own manager. And third, and most closely to what Roger was talking about, 1 in 4 think robots would do a better job than human politicians, a survey of UK consumers finds. So we're already halfway there to getting a majority for Roger's idea. But in this chat today, I'll be talking mostly about AI for judges and for legal decisions. And we can all imagine, and we've heard a lot of hype about this, of a robot judge or a court-appointed chatbot. Is AI threatening the legal profession in terms of replacing lawyers and other legal officials? There is, this is not unreasonable to have this discussion, starting with, there's tons of evidence of human judges making mistakes or being biased or at least being inconsistent. One example I like from the US asylum courts is that depending on which court you end up in, basically which airport you fly into as an asylee, you might have a 50% chance of being denied or a over 80% chance of being denied. And this isn't just differences across courts. Even within the same court in San Francisco, where you're randomly assigned to a judge when you come in as an asylee, if you get one judge, you'll get a 91% chance of getting asylum. But then if you get the bad judge, you only have a 3% chance of getting asylum. And so, these judges, they're not following some objective sense of the law and making these asylum decisions. And this problem isn't just in the US. I can talk about this more in the Q&A if there's interest in it, but there's some related research even from Switzerland that in the federal administrative court for asylum decisions, which judge you get will make a big difference in your chances of getting asylum. So could we have robot judges come into the courts and help human judges be more consistent? I want to show you an example of this and how robot judges can support just more effective human decision-making in the context of anti-corruption policy. So in ongoing work with Sergio Galetta from Bergamo and Tommaso Gemoni, also from ETH Zurich, we are building an automated corruption detector. Our context is Brazil because there's nice data in Brazilian municipalities where there's a set of corruption audit data where large teams of auditors went to these to local municipalities at those that were selected randomly by lottery and spent 2 to 3 weeks looking for corruption, looking through the books. This is an expensive process where each individual audit session costs about 85,000 francs to do. So it's at significant agency expense, but they find a lot of corruption. So about half of audits of these municipalities reveal serious corruption, such as illegal procurement and fraud. We show in our work that we can take the local budget features from these municipalities, which we have 800 variables about revenues, expenditures, debts, and liabilities. And we show that we can take this budget accounts data, take it to new municipalities that the model hasn't seen, and we're able to predict the detection, the presence of corruption. So the system it's not like 100%, right? We can't, it doesn't give you the smoking gun, but it's 72% accurate. So, way better than chance, which, if you just guessed they're not corrupt, you'd be right about half the time. This isn't accurate enough to send someone to jail, but in terms of allocating where auditors should go, then, this is going to, we're going to show in a second that this will make auditing much more effective and efficient. So there's an immediate policy payoff in that we can detect probable corruption nationwide. So under the audits, we could detect actual corruption in a minority of municipalities, but using this corruption detection machine, we can detect probable corruption or risk of corruption for all municipalities in Brazil. So in this research, which we've written up in a working paper, we experiment with replacing random audits with audits targeted by predicted corruption risk. So under the status quo policy, about 200 municipalities would be selected in a year randomly to be audited. So rather than do that, we just take this, the top 200 by predicted corruption probability. To compare these policies, you can see it quite simply in this figure. Under random audits, you get about half of the audits detect corruption and half don't. Under targeted audits, it's much more accurate, where you detect about 176 municipalities that are corrupt, and only 2 of the audits are wasted in the sense that they don't find any corruption. So if we're talking about, saving money by doing fewer audits or detecting more corruption for the same number of audits, this machine learning supported policy can be much more effective. So this isn't a robot judge, but it's a robot corruption detector. The results from Brazil are a promising indication of how AI systems can help bring corrupt officials to justice. And these methods are generalizable to other settings that would have an auditing decision, a reliably measured outcome, and a set of predictive data points. Of course, there are plenty of caveats. I see there's already a couple in the chat that I want to respond to during the Q&A, but we'll come back to that. So revisiting this question, using robot judges to help human judges be more consistent, more effective in their jobs, at least in the case of this limited anti-corruption policy support, I think it seems like a good idea. But we also want to approach the issue of bias. So human judges are biased, and if we take robot judges trained to replicate human judge decisions, will those also be biased? Another way to look at this is, how is the model trained? So revisiting Mrinmaya's discussion of AI-supported education, if we train an AI system to grade essays by replicating the scores given by teachers, if those original teachers were biased against some groups of students, then the essay grading software also will be. So that's something we have to keep track of. Similarly, in medicine, medical decisions about diagnosis and treatment, if they're biased against some groups of patients in the data, then a medical robot trained to make such decisions will also be biased. And then moving back to the courts, in the case of criminal risk scoring, blacks and whites who are otherwise identical are treated the same, and you can the different disadvantaged minorities will vary across context. But in the US case, Black defendants tend to be rated as more risky because they have a longer criminal history. But that criminal history was produced by a biased system of police and judges and prosecutors. And then also these criminal risk scoring systems are measured as, they're trying to predict whether someone will be rearrested again. But if police are more likely to rearrest these defendants, that bias in the system will then get baked into the criminal risk scoring algorithms, which you can see there could be this vicious cycle. So there's now a new and exciting a set of research in AI fairness on how to take these algorithmic decision systems and make them more fair. So let's take the decision of bail in judges trying to decide on bail. And let's say you have a set of data on criminal record, which you want the judges to use. You might have some demographic characteristics, but then you have a sensitive class like their religion, and you wouldn't like that algorithm to discriminate against defendants who are Muslim. The standard approach in machine learning, right, is to put all the data in, but then kind of by construction, the machine learning model will treat Muslims differently if that variable is in the data set. This naive approach of fairness through unawareness is just don't include the variable in the data set. That probably helps, but the issue is that there could be indirect discrimination by the model because other variables such as education will proxy for the protected attribute. So there's no easy or perfect solutions to this problem, actually. This is an area of a lot of research, but I also would want to re-emphasize that the baseline is not a perfect AI judge. The relevant comparison is a biased human judge. And another thing that kind of works in favor of using AI in these settings is that when human judges are biased, it's difficult to detect. I mean, they say that AI or neural nets are a black box. I mean, a human brain is a black box. And so I think that we actually have more opportunities to explore how algorithms are making decisions and then try to detect it more easily when a system is biased towards some groups. Further, and this is what I'll talk about for a second now, AI systems can be used to detect bias among human decision makers. So a setting that I'll talk about for the next few minutes is gender bias or sexism in the US judiciary. You don't have to look too far if you just go on Google News and look up these really quite ugly examples of sexism by judges towards their colleagues or towards litigants and defendants. So it's easy to find examples, but we'd like to say something more statistical, more broad about the broader US judiciary. And we do that through natural language processing. So just as an initial sense of how judges in their written decisions talk about male individuals versus female individuals, you can see here in these word clouds that just looking at the adjectives associated with the different genders, where males are understanding or active or cruel or poised, and females are irritable and hostile and emotional and feminine and rude and immature. You can already see these really unsettling stereotypes just in the broad language used by judges. So in order to get at a more targeted measure of the use of gender stereotypes in judicial language, we use a technology called word embedding, which maps language in a geometric space. So the classic example is that if you move from the point in the word embedding space from man to woman, it's the same shift in the space as king to queen. And you'd find the same thing like for salesman to saleswoman, things like this. And so really in the word embedding space, you get this this measure of the dimension of gender, this semantic concept. And we can measure gender stereotypes as how correlated is this male to female dimension to a stereotypical feature of society, which is the dimension between work and the office and then family in the home. And this is a classic gender stereotype that men are associated with work and women are associated with the family of the home. And we want to see, do judges vary along this use of this stereotype? And we find that they do vary significantly. So on the horizontal axis here, we have what we call gender slant, which is the use of these gender stereotypes. And it's not that surprising that male judges are more stereotyped than female judges. One other intriguing thing we found is that conditional on the number of kids they have, judges that have more daughters relative to sons use fewer gender stereotypes. And so, the gender of your kids is random. So this is kind of a nice natural experiment. But you might be asking, does this gender stereotyping in the judicial language actually matter? And it does. So more stereotyped judges tend to vote against expanding women's rights in their decisions. So this includes reproductive rights, gender discrimination, sexual harassment. It also matters for how they treat colleagues, in the sense that more stereotyped judges are more likely to reverse or reject the decisions by their female colleagues. And they're also less likely to cite opinions by female judges. So these findings, I think, are interesting and important on their own, but they also provide motivation for efforts to improve gender balance in the judiciary. So to conclude, I wanted to provide kind of a more broader set of thoughts on when algorithms should support human decision-making in the case of judges, but also more broadly. Something that I think has become, really well recognized as really useful and effective is machine perception. So, in particular, computer vision, face and voice recognition. These technologies are very accurate. And so, that's a kind of a pro and a con, right? It makes them very useful, extremely high benefits to having these machine perception tools, but it could also cause privacy violations, right? So, there's, I think this was mentioned yesterday that someone had been arrested because a facial recognition system had picked out the wrong person. But overall, I think that these types of using machines for machine perception, I think, makes sense, and we just have to keep track of implementing the right privacy protections. Another issue that has come up in the bias debate is that these machine perception algorithms, such as face recognition, they're often trained on bias. They could be trained on biased data sets. So they could be more accurate for some groups of individuals than others, who's the consumer base and things like that. And that is also a surmountable issue by collecting better data. Something that is kind of going up a level of potential problems and controversy is making decisions based on past behavior. So, copyright infringement detection, automated essay grading, as we discussed, medical treatment decisions, or corruption detection, like the example I showed from Brazil. These are subjective, and so some error is inevitable. These aren't perfectly binary categories. But it is the case that, we've seen examples of this, that human judgments are highly correlated with what the AI gives. And so those predictions could be useful. But a repeated issue that you will find when you start introducing decisions based on AI is that there are reward systems. And so in the case of automated essay grading, I'll put some examples in the chat, but you can get a really good grade on some of these essay grading systems by just repeating long words over and over again. Writing really terrible essays, but getting a good grade. And so these can be kind of brittle. And so the lesson is that the systems have to be monitored, updated, and then also you might want to randomize things just so that people can't perfectly game the system. The third and most difficult set, I think that the biggest challenge for policymakers, something that we should be really careful about, is making decisions based on predicted future human behavior. So these include jail or release based on predicted recidivism, policing allocation based on predicted neighborhood crime, or nominating or promoting judges based on their gender attitudes measured from text. So I would be very careful about doing that. These decisions are going to influence the subsequent choices and behavior of the targeted individuals. And this makes it where you can't monitor or evaluate the impacts of a policy because it will change decisions. And also in all of these cases, errors are costly, and these strong incentive responses make them risky, and they can have unintended consequences. So these are the sets of decisions that I would encourage policymakers to be most careful about. So that's my presentation, and questions and comments are welcome. So I'm going to start with the chat. Deborah, can I unmute you for your question?
Absolutely fascinating. Wow. So, I mean, I work in the corporate world, right? And I hate all the noise around, especially International Women's Day. Do you know anyone who's found similar findings or is doing similar research in biased male senior execs disregarding women? I mean, it happens in academia fields too.
Not in particular, but I think that many people would share your intuition about that, and I think that this would actually be a nice application of the types of bias detection methods that we've been discussing, and also Ryan Cotterell talked about a bit yesterday. And if you could think of a corpus or a collection of these types of communications, then I think that would be an exciting follow-up study.
Cool, awesome. So you'd be up to running some experiments?
We're always looking for new domains to apply these tools, and awesome. that would be a great one.
I'll be in touch. Thanks so much. Brilliant. Great.
So, Karen, do you want to ask this question about the biggest challenge here will be bias? I think that's actually a quite interesting idea. Can I unmute you to ask you what you meant? While we're waiting for Karen, Milena, I'm going to unmute you to ask your question.
Yeah.
Milena, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I was just, while you were talking about application to judicial system, I was recently reading Katie O'Neill's thoughts on
yes.
rigged application and mismanagement of AI in US in particular. So what would you say about implanting error detection or preventing those severe misuses? Like, for example, using proxy when you're deciding about the sentence to someone who is coming from poor background or something like that. Would you see any solution to that?
I think this is a great example of some of the issues that I was talking about. I think that I was focusing somewhat on kind of identity characteristics, but definitely like zip code and like where people are from and who they know is another set of factors that aren't they're not necessarily relevant to whether someone is risky or guilty, but judges and then potentially criminal risk scoring algorithms could learn to use those factors. And it's something that as I mentioned, there's no perfect way to address these issues, but there are these model interpretation and model explanation tools that will tell you which factors the model is using. And so then you could actually use that to explore how AI is making its decisions and figure out if it's actually using the set of factors that we would like it to. I think that in the case of risk scoring, the problem is if you put someone in jail based on the risk score, then they won't commit more crimes, right? Because they're in jail. And so this is what I was kind of saying at the end, is that if you're making a prediction about future behavior, you then make a decision that prevents them from actually committing crimes or not. And so then it's hard to know. You can't figure out whether you made a mistake or not.
Yeah, funny, but while you were talking, it triggers another similar example, because I'm dealing with computational psychiatry. For example, when we are talking about clinical decisions, I strongly believe that the human must be in the loop. I will tell you why. For example, the whole system, how we define clinical diagnosis, for example, in mental health care issues, is great. Because it isn't working, and many psychiatrists are aware of it, and they are trying to find out some other ways. But for example, we were facing another problem from a machine learning perspective. We were trying, actually we had 2 projects already, we are still working on it, to detect, for example, bipolar depression is very tricky because it is very complicated, and you cannot actually make the clear cut between diagnosis and variables, because in the end you have to decide and do algorithm again for every single person. But another thing is discovered that, for example, if you have completely fresh view on the characteristics of people, you can find that, for example, different diagnoses actually have the same features. For example, somebody was connecting different descriptions from series of machine learning studies, and find out, for example, that once you are diagnosed with, let's say, depression, your chances to have another diagnosis rises for 50%. Because once you enter the system and it is somewhere noted that you have certain symptoms,
right, there's going to be decision inertia there. I think this is a good example of how when there's subjectivity in a decision and humans disagree, then we can't expect a machine to do better in most cases. And I think that what you're pointing to of people that have the same characteristics or the same symptoms getting different diagnoses but based on their history is a problem that a machine learning model actually might help with, because it could easily detect. This is the idea of AI systems being able to detect these divergences or biases in human judgments, because you could easily find these cases where, based on the clinically relevant factors, the decision should be the same, but they're not. And so that's an example where you could see some benefit.
No, thank you. It's extremely interesting for me.
Great, thank you, Milena, for your question.
Let's keep in touch.
Yeah, very good. So I think we have time for one more question. Filippo, do you want to add something? I can unmute you.
Sure, thank you. No, I thought this was fascinating. I was wondering if I think that one of the trends in policy really is to bake into the system an option of having a human step in and take over the control over the decision. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on when would this be ideal, when this wouldn't be ideal, and whether this will even be dangerous if you're actually correcting for biases in the decision in the first place. But thank you.
Yes, this is a major issue, and actually one of the presentations at the academic paper workshop last night was about this. I think it's I would say it's a little bit too early to tell it feels like, putting AI making AI the first and final decision maker at this point, it feels too early. But on the other hand, I can see your point that there are some judges who we might fix few mistakes if we just allow human judges to override them. And indeed, there is some evidence that when these risk scoring measures are introduced, human judges don't use them very often. But this is overall an important area for future research. There's a lot to be done, and this is also related to Oriana's question of communicating the uncertainty about AI predictions and decisions, giving explanations for why these decisions were made. I think that there's a lot to be done to help human decision makers trust these predictions and these inputs to make them more useful. So this is actually a very nice time to conclude this session. Thanks everyone for the really interesting questions. Thanks to Roger and Mrinmaya for the other great talks. We will now conclude for 44 minutes. We have the lunch break now, and at 2 p.m. we will see you for the next panel on how data policy can increase trust in AI applications. Thank you and see you soon.